My name is Emily, and 18 months ago, I collapsed in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, gripping the counter with both hands, certain something was dying inside me. And my doctor had just told me, for the third time, that I needed to relax. I want to tell you what was actually happening inside my body in that moment. The thing no one caught. The diagnosis that was missed for months while I was quietly told I was anxious, overtired, hormonal, stressed. I want to tell you, because maybe you have been in that room. Maybe you have sat under those fluorescent lights while someone with a medical degree leaned back in his chair and reduced you to a collection of nervous habits and an overactive imagination. And if you have, I need you to know, I see you. I know exactly how cold that room feels. But right now, today, I am standing at my kitchen window, watching morning light filter through the leaves of the oak tree just outside the glass. Breathing easy. No pain. No white knuckles on the counter. If you had told me that was possible 18 months ago, I would have cried. I am 35 years old. I am not dramatic by nature. I pay my bills on time, I show up early, I drink enough water, and go to bed at a reasonable hour. I am the kind of person who waits until something is truly wrong before walking into a doctor's office, because I was raised to believe that complaining is a kind of weakness. My mother used to say, "Emily, toughen up." I believed her for most of my life. But there are things your body cannot heal on its own. Things that grow quietly in the dark, that whisper instead of shout, that take years before they make themselves impossible to ignore. And when they finally do, when you sit across from someone who is supposed to help you, and that person looks at you like you are wasting his time, something inside you breaks a little. Something broke in me. I remember the exact moment. The fluorescent lights. The paper crinkling beneath me on the table. The way Dr. Harmon folded his hands in his lap with the patience of a man performing patience rather than feeling it. I had been describing my symptoms for maybe 4 minutes. And he looked at me and said, "Emily, I think you need to relax." Relax. Have you ever been dismissed so completely that you started to doubt the evidence of your own suffering? Not just brushed off, but erased, the way a doctor erases a patient when he has already written his conclusion before you have finished your first sentence? When the person holding the clipboard decides, without looking up, that the problem in the room is you. I lived inside that feeling for a long time. And Dr. Harmon never knew what he missed. Never knew the real reason I was sick. A reason that, by the time someone finally found it, had been quietly building inside me for the better part of a year. So I need to take you back. Back to the version of me who still believed the medical system would protect her. Who walked into appointments with a carefully written list of symptoms, smiled politely at the end even when she left with nothing, drove home in silence and told herself, maybe they're right. Maybe it really is stress. Maybe I really am making this up. That Emily, the one gripping the steering wheel on the drive home from Dr. Harmon's office, trying not to cry because she still had to pick up groceries and answer emails and start dinner, had no idea what was actually happening inside her body. No idea that within weeks it would stop whispering and finally force her to the floor. Before I knew what was happening to my body, I thought I was one of the healthiest people I knew. Hold that for a moment, because it matters. This is not a story about someone who ignored obvious warning signs. I woke up before my alarm. I ran 3 miles while the sky was still gray at the edges. I kept a water bottle on my desk, cooked real food on weeknights, owned a yoga mat that actually got used. My friend Cassie used to joke that I was the only person she knew who genuinely enjoyed going to bed early. I had built a life that felt clean and purposeful and mine. So here is the question that still keeps me up sometimes. If I was paying attention, if I knew my own body, how did I miss it for so long? The body does not always announce itself. It does not knock loudly. It scratches. Barely. Just enough to make you pause before you tell yourself, it is nothing, and keep moving. The tiredness came first. Not the ordinary kind. Not the kind that follows a long week or a short night. This was something heavier, something that sat deep in my bones and refused to lift even after a full night's sleep. I told myself I had been pushing too hard, that work had been stressful, that anyone would feel this way. Then the aches started. A dull throb behind my left shoulder blade that came and went. A stiffness in my fingers each morning that I kept meaning to mention to someone, and never did. A vague pressure behind my eyes that I blamed on screen time, on the office lights, on not drinking enough water. I kept adjusting. New pillow. Less caffeine. 30 minutes earlier to bed. I was a problem solver by nature, and so I treated these things as small problems to solve. Inefficiencies in the system of my own body that just needed the right correction. But somewhere around month 2, the corrections stopped working. The shoulder pain was no longer occasional. It had become a presence I built my movements around without realizing it. I stopped reaching for things on high shelves with my left arm. I started sleeping only on my right side. Small adaptations, quiet surrenders. The kind you make so gradually that you do not notice until someone points them out. Cassie pointed it out. We were sitting at her kitchen table when she watched me shift in my chair for the 3rd time and said, "You keep moving like something hurts." I said I thought I had just slept wrong. She gave me the look she had been perfecting for 15 years. Equal parts patient and completely unconvinced, and did not push further. But I could tell she filed it away, the way Cassie always did with things that mattered. That evening, I sat on the edge of my bed and forced myself to take an honest inventory. Not the story I had been telling myself, the actual facts. I made a list on my nightstand notepad. 6 things, each one I had been explaining away for weeks. The exhaustion, the shoulder, the finger stiffness, the pressure behind my eyes, the mornings that felt like climbing out of something heavy, and a 7th I almost did not write down, the way I had quietly stopped running, not because I decided to, but because my body had simply stopped cooperating, and I had let it happen without asking why. Looking at them together on that page, in my own handwriting, under my own lamp, I felt something shift in my chest. Not stress. Not a bad pillow. Something that had been waiting for me to stop looking away. I picked up my phone and made an appointment. My hand was unsteady when I set it back down. I want to be honest about what I expected walking into that office. I expected to be taken seriously. I had the list. I had the timeline. I had months of careful, patient self-observation written out in ink. I thought that would be enough. It wasn't. When I finally sat across from Dr. Adams and slid that list across his desk, he looked at it for a moment, not long, and then looked at me with the kind of settled expression that means a conclusion has already been reached. Just stress, he said. He said it with the confidence of someone closing a door. And he handed the list back as though returning something that had no business being in a doctor's office. I folded it, put it in my bag, thanked him, because that is what you do. But I did not throw it away. And that small act, keeping the list, walking out with it, still in my hands, turned out to matter more than I knew. Because somewhere between his office and my car, something clarified that I could not push back down. His answer was clean and simple and almost convincing. Almost. But a body that is only stressed does not go quiet in the specific ways mine had. It does not stop speaking in languages you once knew without any explanation at all. Silence like that is not the absence of a problem. It is a problem wearing a different face. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. Then I drove home, put the list on my nightstand, and started thinking about who else I could call. The morning I walked into Dr. Adams's office, I already knew, somewhere beneath the careful preparation and the mascara and the white sneakers, that I was about to fight for my own body, and that I might lose. I had been awake since 4. Not because I couldn't sleep, though that had become its own problem, but because I needed to be ready. I had typed up my symptoms on my phone, organized by category, by timeline, by severity. Screenshots of articles, not to self-diagnose. I want to be clear about that. But because I was terrified of forgetting something. Terrified of walking out of that room the same way I had been walking through every other room for the past 3 months. Carrying this thing alone and unnamed. I wore my white sneakers. I put on mascara. I don't know why that detail stays with me, but it does. I remember thinking almost superstitiously that if I looked put together, if I seemed reasonable and calm and credible, he would take me seriously. When the nurse called me back, the paper on the examination table crinkled every time I shifted. Dr. Adams came in about 7 minutes later. I know because I was watching the clock with the specific alertness of someone who has been waiting too long for too many things. He was mid-50s, silver-haired, with the kind of practiced calm I would later learn to read as impatience wearing a professional mask. And I told him everything. The exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. The pain behind my shoulder blade, gone from occasional to constant. The morning stiffness in my fingers. The pressure behind my eyes. The way I had started building my entire day around managing sensations I couldn't explain. I read from my list because I didn't trust myself to remember, because I know how these appointments go, how the clock ticks quietly in the background, and suddenly your carefully organized thoughts scatter, and you walk out having said half of what you meant to say. He listened, or he appeared to listen, which I have since learned is a different thing entirely. When I finished, there was a pause. He tilted his head slightly. The way someone does when they've already made up their mind and are simply deciding how to phrase it. Then he said, "Emily, these symptoms are quite common in women your age who are under significant stress. I think what you're experiencing may be your body's response to anxiety." I stared at him. I had just handed him 6 months of a body breaking down, and what he handed back was a diagnosis of anxious woman, early 30s, probably overwhelmed. I told him that yes, work had been demanding, but that this didn't feel like stress. I told him the pain wasn't something I could breathe through or meditate away. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I knew my body, and this was not normal for me. He nodded through all of it. The nodding was worse than the dismissal somehow. It had the shape of listening without any of the substance. He ordered basic blood work, the kind that checks the most obvious things and can miss a great deal else. He told me to reduce my caffeine intake. He suggested yoga. I told him I already did yoga. He said that was great, to keep it up. He did not order imaging. He did not refer me to anyone. He closed my file, and that was the appointment. I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel, and the list still open on my phone in the passenger seat. And I told myself, give it one more visit. One more chance. Over the next 2 months, I went back 3 times. The blood work came back unremarkable, which he presented as good news, as evidence that I was fine. Each time I described worsening symptoms, he returned the same measured smile, the same advice. Rest more. Stress less. Try to relax. No referral. No imaging. No next step. And in the small hours of the night, When the pain woke me and I lay still in the dark trying to breathe through it, I began to wonder whether I was somehow manufacturing all of this. Whether 6 months of real physical suffering was actually just one long, elaborate panic attack that I had dressed up in clinical language. That is what prolonged dismissal does. It doesn't just delay a diagnosis. It dismantles your belief in your own body until you become the one doing the doctor's work for him, arguing yourself out of your own pain. After the third visit, I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. Then I did something I had been telling myself was an overreaction, an act of distrust, maybe even a betrayal of the process. I picked up my phone and searched for another doctor. Not because I wanted to be difficult, because I was disappearing slowly and no one in that building seemed to notice. He never knew, never suspected, never paused long enough to look deeper. Never considered that while he was attributing my pain to stress and anxiety, something was growing inside me, patient and invisible and completely undetected. The imaging he never ordered, the referral he never wrote, the door he kept closing, gently with a smile every single time. There is a particular kind of medical negligence that leaves no fingerprints. It doesn't look like cruelty. It looks like a man on a rolling stool nodding with reasonable things to say, and nothing ever to find. But I found my way to another office, another doctor, a different kind of listening. And whatever he missed, it was still there, waiting. But so was I. On a Tuesday night in November, alone in my bathroom, I found a lump. In the seconds after my fingers found it, still pressed against my skin, not yet willing to move, I understood with a clarity I had never felt in a doctor's office that my body had been trying to tell me this for months. But I am getting ahead of myself. The weeks after my appointment with Dr. Adams did something to me that I still find difficult to describe. It was not just the dismissal. It was what the dismissal did to the space between me and my own body. I had spent 6 months learning the language of what was happening inside me, and he had spent 40 minutes convincing me I did not speak it at all. So I tried to believe him. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I genuinely tried. I bought a pale blue journal, cut out coffee entirely, went to bed at the same time every night. I ate salads and took walks and did everything that sounds, in retrospect, like a person performing wellness for an invisible audience, hoping the performance would eventually become the reality. The pain did not care. It got worse. Not suddenly, the way water gets into old walls. Quietly, steadily, finding every crack. The ache behind my shoulder blade stopped being something I could manage with movement or position. It became a presence. Constant, low, spiking occasionally into something sharp enough to stop me mid-sentence. I remember standing at my kitchen counter one morning, trying to make toast, and having to grip the edge with both hands and simply wait for the wave to pass. I started losing weight without trying. My jeans began sliding down my hips. My face looked different in the mirror, not thinner in a way anyone complimented. Thinner in a way that made Cassie go quiet when she saw me. She came over one evening in late October. We were supposed to watch something, and she looked at me sitting on the couch wrapped in a blanket even though the apartment was not cold, and she said, "Emily, this is not okay. This is not what stress looks like." I did not argue with her. That was how I knew things had shifted. 6 months earlier, I would have said I was fine, just tired, just a rough few weeks. She asked if I had seen anyone else. I told her about the referral doctor. Adams had never sent, the specialist I had never reached, the phone calls that went nowhere. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm coming with you next time, wherever you go." I told her I would think about it. What I meant was, I have been alone in this for so long that I do not remember how to let someone in. But I heard her. I wrote it down that night, in the journal, the way I was writing everything down by then. Not because I thought I would forget, but because I needed proof that it had happened. That someone had seen me and said, "This is real." Work was the next thing to go. By November, I was missing things I never would have missed before, reading the same paragraph 3 times and retaining nothing, sitting at my desk inside a fatigue so deep it had a texture. My manager, Patricia, called me in for what she framed as a check-in. She said, "I just want to make sure you're all right." I told her I was dealing with some health things and had it under control. I think both of us knew that neither part of that sentence was entirely true. I tried supplements, acupuncture, a chiropractor, a massage therapist who worked on the muscles around my shoulder for a full hour and told me they were in severe spasm. Nothing helped in any lasting way. Everything gave me a few hours of slightly less, followed by the same returning weight. I stopped going out. Not because I did not want to see people, but because existing in rooms full of noise and light and expectation required an energy I no longer had. The isolation settled in so quietly, I almost did not notice it arriving. And inside that quiet, the fear grew. Not the anxious, scattered fear doctor Adams had tried to diagnose. Something older and colder. The kind that does not live in your thoughts. The kind that lives in your bones. Somewhere in those weeks, I stopped writing in the journal the way I had started it. Searching for anxiety. Trying to prove him right. It became something else. Evidence. I stopped writing about my moods and started writing about my body. The pain rated and timed. The weight noted every few days. The fatigue mapped against sleep and food and the day before. I did not know exactly why. I think I knew, without being able to say it plainly, that I was going to need to prove something to someone, and I was not going to walk into another office empty-handed. I was building a case. For myself first, and then, I hoped, for whoever would finally agree to hear it. And then, on a Tuesday night in November, alone in my bathroom, I found something that made every page of that journal matter in a way I had not let myself imagine. Not an explanation. A reckoning. I found a lump, and in that moment, fingers pressed against my own neck in a dim bathroom at 2 a.m. I understood that 9 months of being told I was fine had just run out of road. It was small, tucked just beneath the skin along the left side of my neck. Firm. Difficult to move. The size of a grape, maybe smaller but undeniably present. I had only found it because I had been pressing into the tender area that had been aching for days, trying to locate the source the way you do when you are too exhausted to do anything else but map your own pain. I stood there for a long time. The faucet was dripping. My fingers were still against my neck. I did not sleep that night. By morning, I had made a decision. I was done with Dr. Adams. Done with the measured smile and the closed file and the quiet suggestion that my body was lying to me. I was going to find someone who would actually look. It took 3 weeks and more phone calls than I want to count. I eventually paid out of pocket for a consultation with an internist across town named Dr. Miriam Chen, because someone in an online forum had written that she was the kind of doctor who listened first and concluded second. And at that point, a stranger's comment on the internet was more than I had anywhere else to go on. I walked into her office expecting to be disappointed again. I had built a kind of protective resignation around that expectation. She dismantled it in about 10 minutes. Doctor. Chen sat across from me with no desk between us and asked me to start from the beginning. Not from the last appointment. From the beginning. So I told her everything. The fatigue that had followed me for nearly a year. The pain behind my shoulder blade that nothing had ever fully touched. The 12 pounds I had not tried to lose. The brain fog. And the night sweats I had never even mentioned to Dr. Adams because I had already learned to pre-edit myself for doctors with limited patience. I told her about the lump. I told her I had been told to relax. She did not nod in the way that means nothing. She took real notes in a small notebook she held in her hand. When I finished, she looked at me directly and said, "I want to run a specific panel, not the standard workup, imaging, and some markers that aren't part of a routine screen." I almost cried right there. I held it together, but just barely. The tests took days to schedule and more days to complete. A CT scan, a PET scan, blood draws for markers I had to look up because I did not recognize the names. A biopsy of the lump, which turned out to be less physically painful than the months of not knowing had been. Then the waiting. Time moved differently. I would be fine for an hour, genuinely distracted, and then I would remember, and the floor would shift slightly beneath everything. I cleaned my apartment compulsively. I called my mother in Ohio more than I had in years and never told her why. I just wanted to hear her voice, her familiar complaints about the weather. The way she said my name like it had 2 extra syllables. She had no idea she was anchoring me. Cassie came over most evenings. We did not talk about the tests. We watched television, and she sat close enough on the couch that I could feel her warmth without either of us having to say anything about what we were both thinking. She never once told me I was overreacting. And then, just as I had almost convinced myself the results would be nothing, that I would have to start all over again, that maybe they had all been right, and I was simply falling apart for no reason, my phone rang. Dr. Chen's number. I answered on the second ring, in a voice that did not sound like mine. She asked if I was somewhere I could sit down. I said yes. I sat. She told me they had the results. The imaging and the biopsy together had given them a clear picture. She wanted me to come in to discuss next steps, but she felt it was important to tell me now, rather than ask me to wait another day. I understood from that single sentence that whatever she was about to say was the kind of thing that doesn't just change your life. It divides it into before and after, and you never get to go back to standing on the other side of it. She said the name. Hodgkin's lymphoma. Stage 2. The words didn't land so much as detonate, because I had spent 9 months being told I was anxious, being told I needed to breathe, being told there was nothing wrong, that the pain behind my shoulder blade was muscular, that the fatigue was stress, that the weight loss was within a normal range and not worth investigating further. And now there was a name for it. A real name with a real shape, sitting in a real body. A body that had been trying to tell someone, anyone, for the better part of a year. Dr. Chen kept talking. She used words like treatable and caught and good prognosis, and I heard every one of them, and they mattered, and I held on to them. But underneath those words, something else was also true. Something that existed alongside the relief and would not be canceled out by it. I had been right. Every exhausted, frightened, dismissed version of me that had sat in that office and been handed a closed file, I had been right. I held the phone against my ear and said nothing for a moment that felt very long. And in that silence, I thought about the man who had smiled and told me to relax. And I felt something settle in me, like a stone dropping to the bottom of still water. Not fear, not anger. The particular grief of time that cannot be given back. And beneath it, harder and quieter. The knowledge that I had not given up on myself when it mattered most. That, at least, was mine. The morning the phone rang, I was standing in my kitchen in an oversized t-shirt. By the time I hung up, I was sitting on the floor. I don't know when I sat down. You expect news like this to arrive like a wave, something cinematic and immediate. And instead, there is just a strange, cushioned silence. I heard every word, doctor, Chen said. Treatment timelines, oncology referrals, reasons for optimism. I understood none of it. Some part of my brain had simply stepped out of the room. I thanked her. I don't know why that was the first thing I did, but I thanked her, told her I would call to schedule the follow-up, and hung up. I set my phone on the counter very carefully, as if it were made of something fragile. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor. The linoleum was cold through my shirt. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went past with its radio on, something with a cheerful beat, and the sheer absurdity of that nearly broke me open before anything else did. Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 2, possibly advancing. 9 months of going in and being turned away. 9 months of being handed pamphlets about stress reduction while something grew inside my body with absolute indifference to what Dr. Adams had chosen to believe. The anger came then, sudden and clean and so sharp it almost felt like relief. I pressed my back against the cabinet and let it move through me because it was the first thing I'd felt in 20 minutes that was undeniably real. He had smiled at me. He had closed my file, leaned back in his chair, and told me I needed to relax. And I had believed him enough to apologize. I had believed him enough to wonder if I was the problem. Months of performing wellness for a man who had already decided what I was before I finished a single sentence. I thought about the notebook, the night sweats logged by date and time, the weight tracked week by week, as the numbers dropped without explanation, every piece of evidence I had walked through his door carrying, and how he had looked at all of it and seen nothing but anxiety. The notebook was still on my nightstand. I had kept it because some part of me had refused to stop believing my own body, even when he made me doubt it. Now I understood why I could never throw it away. I called Cassie from the floor. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright mid-sentence with someone in her office. When she heard mine, she went quiet. I said the name. I heard her breath catch, that small, involuntary sound, and then, I'm coming. Right now. She was there in 40 minutes. I'd managed to get off the floor by then. I'd made tea I didn't drink and opened my laptop, because not knowing felt more unbearable than knowing, even when the knowing was this. Hodgkin's lymphoma, I read, was one of the more treatable forms. Stage 2 meant it hadn't yet spread beyond the lymphatic system. Survival outcomes were, relative to many other cancers, among the more favorable. I stared at that word. Treatable. I turned it over the way you hold something you aren't sure is real. And then came the thought I couldn't push away. Quiet and merciless and precise. Treatable 9 months ago, too. Possibly more so. I closed the laptop before I could follow that line somewhere I couldn't come back from. When Cassie walked in, she didn't say anything at first. She just crossed the room and put her arms around me. That was the moment I finally cried. Not quietly. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere lower than the chest, the kind that has been waiting a long time to be let out. She held on and said nothing, which was exactly right. I had spent so long being asked to justify and explain and prove that being asked what I needed felt like a different language entirely. I didn't have an answer. But the fact that she asked mattered more than I knew how to say. I called my mother that evening. I heard her voice change. That particular shift, when a parent receives news they have no preparation for. I told her she didn't have to. She said, I know I don't have to. Margaret arrived 2 days later with a suitcase too large for the length of her visit and enough food to survive a siege. Not you. We. One syllable, and the loneliness cracked straight down the middle. Within the first hour, she picked up the small notebook from my nightstand, the one with the dates and symptoms and recorded weights, and without a word, set it on the kitchen table between us. She looked at it for a long moment. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She pressed her lips together and nodded once, slowly. And I understood she was holding back something she had decided not to say yet. For my sake. I loved her for that. But she didn't put it back. She left it on the table, and I understood without either of us saying, so that it wasn't going back to the nightstand. It was going to the oncologist. It was going to every room we walked into from here. 9 months of evidence that I had known, that I had tried, that I had not imagined a single word of it. That notebook was no longer just a record of what had been missed. It was the first thing we would carry forward. In the quiet that followed, the phone calls, the crying, the research, my mother's arrival. 2 questions settled into me with a weight that would not lift. How was I supposed to fight something this enormous, this ruthless, this indifferent to everything I had tried to do right? And how was I ever supposed to forgive the man who had looked me in the eye, month after month, and chosen not to see me at all? I didn't have answers yet. But somewhere under the fear, something else was forming, quieter than anger, steadier than grief. The part of me that had kept the notebook. The part that had never stopped believing my own body, even when I was the only one who did. That part wasn't finished. The first week of treatment, I told myself I was ready. I was wrong. I had done the reading. I had asked Dr. Chen every question I could think of, written them down in a small notebook the night before my first appointment, sat across from her with a pen in my hand as if preparation alone could shield me from what was coming. She had been patient with every single one, and I had nodded and taken notes and believed in the way you believe something before you have actually lived it, that I understood. I did not understand. The chemotherapy protocol was called ABVD, 4 drugs administered together once every 2 weeks. The nurses at the infusion center were kind without being falsely cheerful, which I appreciated more than I could ever tell them. I sat in a reclining chair by a window and watched the IV drip and told myself this was the thing that was going to save me. For the first 2 days after that initial infusion, I felt almost nothing. I thought maybe this won't be so bad. Maybe I'm one of the lucky ones. By the 3rd day, I understood why I had been warned. The nausea came first, and it was not the polite, manageable kind. It was total, a presence in the room with me, constant and without mercy. Then came the fatigue, and that word does not come close to describing what I mean. Tired is something you feel after a long week. What settled into my body was something else entirely. A heaviness that went below muscle and bone, that made lifting my arm feel like a negotiation. I slept and woke up exhausted. I slept again and woke up the same way. I lost my appetite almost entirely. My mother, Margaret, stood in my kitchen and made things I had loved since childhood. Soft things, careful things. And I would manage a few bites and then sit with my hands in my lap, staring at the plate, feeling like a failure. She never said anything. She just wrapped it up, put it in the refrigerator, and sat with me. We watched old films in the evenings, and she rubbed my back when the nausea returned in waves. She did not cry in front of me, though I knew she did when she was alone, because I could hear it sometimes through the wall. I would lie in the dark listening and feel the particular grief of being someone else's worst fear made real. By the 2nd cycle, my hair started going. I had known it would happen. I had thought I had made peace with it in advance. I had not. There is no making peace with something in advance. I found it on my pillow one morning, more than I expected, and I stood in the bathroom holding it in my hand and something cracked open in me that I did not know how to close. Cassie came with me when I had it cut short, then shorter. She held my hand in the chair and talked too fast and too cheerfully, the way she does when she is trying very hard not to cry. She did not let go until the stylist was finished. Outside, she laughed at herself and wiped her face with her sleeve and squeezed my arm and said, "You still look like you." I did not believe her, but I held on to it anyway. The pain was its own category. Some days it was the bone aches that can come with certain chemotherapy drugs. Deep and impossible to position yourself away from. Some days it was the mouth sores that made eating feel close to punishment. Some days it was everything at once, and I would lie in bed at night with my eyes open, searching for one comfortable position in my own body and never finding it. And somewhere inside all of that, something else was happening that was harder to name. I started waking in the early hours with thoughts that had no exits. Circular, flat, exhausted thoughts. I would lie there and try to imagine the future and find that I could not see it. Not in a dramatic way, just a blankness where an image should have been, like reaching for a dream that is already gone. I questioned everything. Whether fighting this hard for something I could not picture was worth the relentless cost of fighting. Those thoughts frightened me more than any of the physical symptoms. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell Cassie, not fully. I said I was hanging in there. I said some days were harder than others. So I smiled when people came over. I performed a version of myself that was coping, because the alternative felt like admitting something I was not sure I could take back. One evening, after Margaret had gone to bed, I walked to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. The person looking back at me was wearing my face and my faded gray t-shirt, but the resemblance stopped somewhere shallow. The hollows under her eyes were deep. Her shoulders curved inward like she was bracing for impact. I stood there for a long moment and tried to find myself in her, and the distance between who I had been and who I was looking at felt enormous and uncrossable. I thought about the notebook on my nightstand, every question filled in and answered, and how none of it had prepared me for standing here. I thought about how thoroughly I had prepared, and how the thing I was facing now had left no blank page for itself. No question written down for it. No answer waiting on the other side. Standing there in the bathroom light, with the faucet dripping and the apartment quiet around me, I understood something I had no words for yet. I had prepared for the disease. I had not prepared for disappearing. That was when I did the only thing I had not yet tried. I went back to the nightstand. I opened the notebook to the first blank page I could find. And I wrote down one more question, not about dosages or timelines or what to expect from the next cycle. Just, I think something is wrong that isn't the cancer. Who do I tell? I did not know if anyone could answer it. I did not know if asking it out loud would change anything. But I wrote it down because the notebook had been my way of insisting that the things I feared most were at least worth naming. And this, whatever this was, deserved the same. What I would learn, slowly and not all at once, is that the blankness had a name. That depression is common in people going through cancer treatment. That it is something a care team can actually help with. That the inability to imagine a future is its own symptom. As real and as reportable as the nausea, the bone pain, the sores. I did not know that yet. But I had written the question, and that turned out to be the first step toward finding out that the blankness was not the truth. Only the last thing you see before the truth becomes visible. I don't know exactly when the shift happened, but I know where it started. On a cold bathroom floor, at 3 a.m, thinking thoughts that had no exits, and asking myself, for the first time, whether I was going to keep letting this happen to me. It had been maybe an hour since I'd slid down the wall. The tiles were cold through my pajamas. The faucet was still dripping. I had been thinking the same thoughts I always thought at that hour. The ones with no exits, the ones that circled back to the same blank wall no matter which direction I started from. And then, for a reason I still cannot fully explain, I picked up my phone. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I went past news, past photographs of people living their lives somewhere else. And then I landed somewhere I had never thought to look. A forum, one of those quiet corners of the internet where people with exactly my diagnosis wrote about what it was actually like. Not the clinical language. Not what the pamphlet said. What it was like at 3 a.m. on the bathroom floor. There was a woman there. Her username something simple I can no longer remember. And she had written about the mirror moment. About not recognizing herself. About the washed out quality she described in almost the exact words I would have chosen. She wrote that she had been convinced at that point that she had already lost. That the version of herself who was going to survive was a fiction she could no longer maintain. And then she wrote about what happened next. She had sought out a second opinion, found a specialist who took her concerns seriously, connected with a care team that coordinated oncology, mental health, and nutrition together rather than in silos. She described it not as a miracle, but as a door. Just a door, she said. You have to be willing to walk through it. But it exists. I read it twice. Then a third time. Then I sat there on the cold tiles and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly, not yet. More like the memory of hope. The faint outline of what hope felt like before everything had used it up. A signal through static, weak and intermittent and real. I thought about what Dr. Harrison had done. The months of dismissal, the condescension, the you need to relax, and there's nothing to worry about. The 1.5 years I lost to someone who looked at me and chose comfort over accuracy. I had been carrying that anger for weeks like a stone I didn't know what to do with. Sitting there on the floor, I felt something shift in how I was holding it. The anger was still there. It didn't go anywhere. But it changed shape, stopped feeling like a wound, and started feeling like a reason. Not a weapon, not something sharp I needed to aim at anyone. Just a reason. A reason to stop waiting for someone else to finally see what I had known all along about my own body. He had chosen not to see me. Fine. Then I was going to see myself hard enough to make up for every appointment he had wasted. I got up off the floor. Not dramatically. Not all at once. I got up the way you get up when your legs have been folded under you too long. Carefully, one hand on the wall. But I got up. I went to my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and started writing. Other specialists, patient advocacy organizations, support groups I hadn't known to look for, questions that deserved real answers. I wrote for almost an hour, and by the time I stopped, I had 2 pages of notes and 3 email drafts waiting to be sent in the morning. The dripping faucet was still audible from where I sat. Steady, patient, indifferent. I thought, I am not that. I am not something that just drips and waits. I made a note to fix it in the morning. And the smallness of that intention felt strangely, like evidence that I intended to be here for it. I had been enduring for so long, absorbing everything, white-knuckling through each cycle, performing recovery for everyone who needed to see it. But this was different. This was about taking it back. My diagnosis, my treatment, my body, my story. Taking it back from Dr. M. Ceiling I had stared at and felt nothing stare back. I didn't know yet what the second opinion would find. I didn't know whether the door the woman described would open onto something manageable or something harder than what I already knew. That uncertainty had always been the thing that sent me back to the floor. But here was the difference. I was going to find out. On my own terms, with my own questions, with people who were willing to actually look. And sitting at my kitchen table in the dark, the city quiet outside my window, 2 pages of notes spread in front of me. That felt like enough to go on. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But the first solid thing I had stood on in a long time. The only question now was what I was going to find when I finally got someone to look. 3 emails sent before 7 in the morning, before I had even made coffee. And for a moment after I pressed send on the last one, I sat completely still and asked myself the question I had been afraid to ask for months. What if I had been looking for help in all the wrong places? That was day 1 of what I had started thinking of privately as the search. It took me almost 2 weeks to get my records transferred, compiled, and organized into something that actually meant something. I had not realized how scattered everything was until I tried to gather it. Labs from one facility, imaging from another, notes from doctor. Harrison's office that read more like dismissals than documentation. Reading through them made my jaw tight. But I read every page. I needed to understand what I was carrying before I could hand it to someone new. Cassie helped me build a spreadsheet. 4 hours later, I had a timeline, a symptom log going back nearly 2 years, a list of every medication and dosage and date, and a summary I could hand to any new doctor and say, "This is everything. This is where we start." It was the most useful thing anyone had done for me in months. The first second opinion I sought was with a specialist about 90 minutes from home. Highly regarded, her name appearing across multiple papers I had found during my late-night reading. My mother, Margaret, offered to come. I told her I needed to do this one alone. Her name was Dr. Anita Voss. She was in her 50s, compact and precise. With reading glasses she kept pushing up with one finger. She did not rush. She did not look at her watch. She read through the summary Cassie and I had built, asked questions that made clear she had actually read it, and then she sat back and said something that changed the temperature of the entire room. I want to be honest with you. This is a complex case. I had to press my hands flat against my thighs to keep them from shaking. She referred me onward, not because she couldn't help, but because she knew of a program that specialized in exactly what I was dealing with. A comprehensive cancer center 3 states away, attached to a teaching hospital, with a multidisciplinary team that included oncologists, registered dietitians, a pain management specialist, and a psychologist embedded directly into the treatment track. Before I stood up to leave, I asked her once whether she thought it was worth it. The distance, the disruption, the starting over again with strangers. She looked at me without hesitating and said, "It isn't starting over." I drove home with the referral letter on the passenger seat beside me. I didn't play music. I just drove. Getting an appointment at the Meridian Institute took 11 days, a second records transfer, and a phone intake interview that lasted an hour and a half. I answered every question. I held nothing back. I pulled up the spreadsheet and read from it directly when the intake coordinator asked about timelines and medications and patterns of symptoms. All those hours on that Saturday suddenly had a purpose I could point to. When I finally walked into their building, I noticed 2 things at once. The ordinary sound of it, phones, footsteps, someone laughing down a corridor, and the fact that no one looked at me like a problem to be managed. No one asked me to calm down. No one looked at my file inside. The physician who led my intake team was a man named Dr. Samuel Okafor, and he had an unhurried quality that felt almost disorienting after everything I had been through. He introduced me to the dietitian, to the psychologist, to the nurse coordinator, who would be my main point of contact. I had 14. I had written them in my phone during the drive, adding to a list I had been keeping for weeks. Questions that previous appointments had never left room for. He answered everyone. He did not glance at the clock. He did not move on until I indicated I was ready. The plan they laid out was not simple. Months of carefully sequenced treatment, regular reassessment points, built-in flexibility for whatever my body might need along the way. When Dr. Okafor finished describing the full arc of it, I sat with the weight of it for a moment. Then I thought about the symptom log. I thought about 2 years of documentation. I thought about every dismissal, every sigh, every appointment that had sent me home with nothing but more uncertainty. And I thought about Dr. Voss. It isn't starting over. It's the first time you'll be starting right. I said yes. I called Margaret from the parking lot. She answered on the first ring. I said, I found them. She went quiet for a moment, and then I heard her exhale, long and slow, like she had been holding that breath since all of this began. The road ahead was real and hard, and full of things I could not predict. But for the first time, in longer than I could remember, I did not feel like I was walking into a wall. I felt like I was walking towards something. And somewhere underneath the fear, underneath the exhaustion, underneath everything this disease had taken, and everything the fight ahead was going to cost me, I felt it. Not hope as a comfort, hope as a weapon. The belief, stubborn and specific, that I actually had a chance. Treatment nearly broke me before it had a chance to save me. I remember the exact Tuesday it started. I had always associated Tuesdays with something manageable. The middle child of the week. Not too close to the beginning or the end. I was looking for signs everywhere by then, and I decided that counted as one. Doctor. Okafor's team had prepared me as well as anyone can be prepared for something like this. Patricia, the nurse coordinator, whose calm felt almost structural, had walked me through the first cycle step by step. She told me what to expect, what was normal, what to call about immediately, and gave me her direct line. I had written everything down in the small notebook I now carried everywhere. I read my notes 3 times the night before I came in. None of it fully prepared me. The infusion suite was bright and quiet, lined with reclining chairs separated by thin curtains. I chose one near the window and watched the medication move through the IV line and told myself to breathe and think of nothing. And my body answered by immediately cataloging everything it could feel. The coolness moving up my arm. The low hum of machines. The way light shifted across the floor as clouds passed outside. By the time I got home that first evening, I was exhausted in a way that had no bottom to it. Not sleepy. Something deeper than sleepy. I ate half a bowl of soup Margaret had left in my refrigerator, lay down on top of my covers still dressed, and was gone before the room got dark. The days that followed taught me what the word difficult actually meant. I had thought I understood fatigue. I had lived with it for over a year. That grinding tiredness Dr. Harrison had told me was stress. But this was different. This settled into my bones. Some mornings I would make it as far as the bathroom and have to sit on the edge of the tub for 10 minutes before I could go on. My hands shook. My appetite vanished for stretches of days. Nausea came in waves at unpredictable hours, and there was a tenderness throughout my body I hadn't anticipated. As if my skin had developed a new sensitivity to the simple fact of being a body at all. I cried on day 4, not gracefully. I sat in my kitchen in the afternoon light with a cup of tea. I hadn't touched and cried because I was tired and my hands hurt and I had knocked the tea over reaching for it. Then I cried because I had cried about spilled tea, which felt like proof I was falling apart. Cassie happened to call right in the middle of it. She listened without trying to fix anything, and then she said, "Falling apart in your kitchen isn't weakness." I laughed, which surprised me. Then I cleaned up the tea and called Patricia. The protocol included something I hadn't anticipated. A psychologist, a quietly direct man named Dr. Marcus Webb, who met with me regularly in those early weeks. I had been skeptical. I had enough to manage without examining my feelings on a schedule. But Dr. Webb had a way of cutting through the performance of being fine that I had rehearsed so long I had almost forgotten. It was a performance. In our second session, he said, "You've spent a long time curating other people's comfort with your illness." I sat with that for a long time. I thought about Dr. Harrison's waiting room, the careful way I had described my symptoms so as not to seem dramatic, the months I had spent Googling in private and saying nothing at dinner parties, the energy I had given to making this easier for everyone around me. Then I thought about the infusion suite, how I had chosen the chair nearest the window, not because of the light, but because it faced away from the other patients, so no one would see if I was struggling. How I had smiled at Patricia when she checked my line and said I was fine when I was not even close to fine. Even here, inside the hardest thing I had ever done, I was still performing. I told Dr. Webb I didn't yet have a good answer for what it felt like to stop. He said that was the most honest thing anyone had said to him all week. And here's the part I didn't expect. I wasn't sure I wanted to find that answer. Because somewhere underneath the careful management and the practiced composure, I was afraid of what was actually there, waiting. The small victories, when they came, arrived quietly. A morning the nausea hadn't arrived yet, and I made eggs and ate all of them. A walk I completed around my block, slowly, holding the thought of it in my chest like something fragile. A call from Patricia, something warm in her voice, telling me the numbers were moving in the right direction. I did not celebrate loudly. I noted them. I wrote them in the notebook. I let them become evidence. Because on the nights when doubt crept in at 3 a.m. and sat uninvited on the edge of my bed, I needed to reach for that notebook and remind myself that something was shifting. That the body I was fighting so hard to keep was beginning, slowly, improbably, to respond. On the worst of those nights, I thought about what Cassie had said. I extended the logic. Maybe 3 a.m. belongs to doubt. And maybe doubt is not a verdict, only a visitor who hasn't learned to knock. I wrote that down too. Every day was its own battle. There were days I almost didn't make it through without losing something. My composure, my courage, the story I was telling myself about why this was worth it. But through the long, hollow hours of treatment rooms and side effects and uncertainty, I began to notice something I hadn't dared name until then. A shift, small and fragile and real. And underneath it, something that frightened me almost as much as the illness itself. Because if it was working, that meant the future was no longer hypothetical. And I would have to decide, with whatever came next, who I intended to be inside it. This time, I didn't want the answer to be someone performing fine. The side effects were not going away. And for a long time, I believed that meant I was failing. I want to be honest about that because there is a version of this kind of story where the turning point arrives and the suffering quietly recedes. And that was not my experience. What changed was not the difficulty. What changed was me. Patricia had told me in one of our early check-ins that some patients find it helps to stop fighting the side effects and start working with them instead. I had nodded when she said it. The way you nod when someone tells you something you cannot yet understand, but feel you should memorize. It took several more weeks of bad mornings before I understood what she actually meant. The nausea came predictably around mid-morning. I stopped scheduling anything before noon. The fatigue peaked in the days after each infusion cycle. So I stopped expecting myself to function during that time and started preparing for it. Filling the refrigerator the day before, setting out everything I would need within arm's reach. Treating those stretches the way you might treat a storm. You do not argue with a storm. You prepare for it and you wait. It sounds small. It was not small. It was one of the hardest mental adjustments I had ever made. Accepting that my body had a new rhythm and that my life had to reshape itself around that rhythm rather than demanding it return to what it had been before. And accepting that was not surrender. It took me a long time to see the difference. Then Margaret said it plainest. We were sitting on my balcony one evening, watching the last light go orange over the rooftops, and she said, "You keep talking about getting back to yourself." I looked at my hands resting on my knees, thinner than they used to be, sometimes still faintly unsteady, and I stayed with that for a while. I didn't have an answer. But for the first time in a long time, I did not feel the need to argue the question away. That, I would come to understand, was its own kind of progress. Margaret had become something close to a second presence in my apartment. 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just sitting with me while I rested. He never made it feel like charity. I made a quiet note to myself that I would tell him that directly, eventually. Some things deserve to be said out loud. Cassie had organized something I initially resisted. A small rotating group of friends who took turns being reachable on my harder days. She called it the coverage schedule, which made it sound like a work arrangement. And somehow that made it easier to accept. I was still not good at asking for help. But having it offered within a structure I didn't have to manage was different. The group drew from different chapters of my life. Diane, from my old job, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Ruth, a college friend 3 states away, who called every Sunday without fail. And John, a neighbor from 2 floors down, who left small things outside my door on the bad weeks. Fruit, a magazine, and once a very small cactus with a note that read, "These are basically unkillable, like you." I kept the cactus on my windowsill. It was still alive. Every time I looked at it, I let myself believe the word a little more. Doctor. Webb had been asking me, across our sessions, what I used to love. Not what I had done professionally, not what I was good at, but what had once made me lose track of time. I had struggled to answer. The disease, and then the long fight to be believed, and then the fight to be treated had consumed so much of my interior life that when I reached back for the things that had once made me simply happy, they felt distant and a little foreign. Slowly, I started returning to some of them. I had painted in my 20s, badly and joyfully, so I bought a small watercolor set and began again. I was still bad at it. It still turned out to be one of the most grounding things I had introduced into my weeks. There was something important about doing something with my hands that carried no clinical outcome, no blood work attached to it, no number to monitor. The painting did not care how I was doing. I could just sit with it. The mindfulness practice doctor Webb had suggested was something I had quietly dismissed. Until the session where he asked me to describe what was happening in my body in that exact moment. Not what I feared might happen. Not what had happened yesterday. Just now. I did it slowly, and something settled. I started practicing on my own. Not every day. Some days. Enough. And on the days I did, I was less likely to spiral into the old habit of rehearsing worst-case scenarios in the dark. The one that had kept me awake too many nights before the diagnosis, and too many nights after. I was not healed. I was not finished. The road was still long, and the outcome was still not something I could hold in my hands and call certain. But something was happening beneath all of it. Something harder to name than blood work results, or reduced nausea, or a morning I made it around the block twice. It was no longer just about treating the disease. It was about learning for the first time, and with considerable difficulty, that I was worth the trouble of healing. And as my body began, slowly and haltingly, to respond to what Dr. Okafor's team was doing, I started to recognize something I had never once considered across all those months of fighting to be taken seriously and fighting to survive. The strength was never built by any of this. It was only ever uncovered. I was only beginning to understand how deep the uncovering went, and what it would cost me to go deeper still, because the next round of results was coming. That was when I knew the numbers were going to ask something of me. I just didn't yet know what. The call came on a Tuesday morning, and I almost didn't answer. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I had actually wanted, the small watercolor set open in front of me. Something loose and blue, water or sky, I wasn't sure which. The cactus was on the windowsill. The light was good. When my phone rang and I saw Patricia's name, my hand went still over the paper. I had learned, across all those months, to read things into the silences before Patricia spoke. The length of the pause, the quality of her breath. I had become fluent in a language I had never wanted to learn. So when she said my name and then said, "I have your scan results and I need you to sit down," I gripped the edge of the table. Then she said, "Emily." Part of me waited for the qualification, for the but, for the however, for the word that would come in and take it back. Patricia had known me long enough to understand this. She didn't rush. She let the words stay in the air between us. The imaging shows significant reduction. The response has been stronger than we hoped for at this stage. Doctor. She did. Slowly and clearly, and with the warmth I had heard building in her voice across weeks of small incremental victories, and this time I let it land. I had been braced for so long that letting it land took effort. It was a strange thing to have to work at receiving good news, but that was what months of the opposite had done to me. Trained my body to expect the floor to fall away, so that even solid ground felt like something to be suspicious of. I sat with Patricia's voice in my ear and made myself stay in the room. Made myself not start calculating what it couldn't mean. Just let it be what it was. The scan showed what months of treatment and stubbornness and restructured days and hard mornings and a small, unkillable cactus and a watercolor set, and a therapist asking me the right unbearable questions, and a best friend on my balcony saying the truest thing, had all been working toward. The disease was retreating, not tentatively, decisively, measurably. Doctor. Okafor, when I sat across from him 2 days later, used the word remarkable. He said it plainly and without performance, and coming from him it landed with the full weight of everything it meant. You gave us something to work with, Emily. I had to look at the wall for a moment after that. He walked me through the imaging with his usual careful patience, outlined the next phase of treatment, talked about monitoring timelines and follow-up intervals. His voice was steady and precise, and underneath the precision was something that felt, if I was reading it right, like genuine relief. Before I left, I asked him the question I had been carrying since the morning Patricia called. Not the clinical part. I knew the clinical part. I meant what it meant in the larger sense, the going forward sense. He looked at me for a moment. Then, it means the future is yours to negotiate again, Emily. I sat with that on the drive home. The future is yours to negotiate. I turned it over the way you turn over something you've found, and aren't sure yet whether to keep. It was a generous thing to say. It was also, I realized, a question disguised as an answer. The future being mine to negotiate meant I had to decide what to negotiate it toward. I wasn't sure I remembered how to do that. For so long, the only direction had been through. I called Margaret from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring, and I said, "The scan was good." She did. Cal came too. We sat in my apartment until late, the three of us, and we didn't talk about the illness very much at all. We talked about a trip Margaret wanted to plan for the spring. Something funny that had happened to Cal at work. I told her I honestly wasn't sure. Later, Cal looked at the painting, then at me. "Are you going to keep doing this?" I said I thought I might. He nodded like that was exactly the right answer, though I hadn't known it was until I said it. Cassie called that night after they left, Ruth the following morning, and John from downstairs knocked and left a small plant on my doorstep. A real one this time, with flowers, and a note that said, "Told you so." I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the note still in my hand. John had said months ago that keeping things alive meant something. I had not forgotten that. I set his plant on the windowsill beside the cactus, and for a moment the two of them sat there together in the afternoon light. And I thought about all the small, ordinary acts of persistence that had carried me from that first hard morning to this one. The cactus had needed almost nothing. John's plant would need more. I found I didn't mind the idea of that. The relief was enormous and also strangely quiet. The way it feels to set down something very heavy after carrying it so long that you had forgotten what your own hands were for. Not triumphant. Not loud. Just the body adjusting to an unexpected lightness. But I knew, even sitting in that relief, that there was more ahead. Not just the continued treatment, the follow-up scans, the long road of what comes after surviving something like this. There was a version of my life that the illness had interrupted, a self that had been set aside, a world I had stopped moving through freely. I had a second chance now, a real one, and a real second chance was different from a reprieve. A reprieve was permission to stay still. A second chance was a direction you had to choose. Dr. Okafor had called it options. Margaret had called it the point. John had called it simply told you so. I looked at the two plants on the windowsill, and the open watercolor set, and the loose blue painting that was either water or a feeling, or both. What was I going to do with it? The first morning I went back to the studio, I almost didn't walk through the door. I stood in the doorway for nearly a full minute, hand on the frame, coffee going cold, asking myself whether I was actually ready, or whether I was only pretending to be ready, because I needed to believe that the worst was behind me. It was a small graphic design firm, not far from my apartment, and I had worked there for 6 years before everything fell apart. My desk was still in the same corner by the window. Someone had watered the succulent I had left behind. I did not know who, and I found that I was more moved by that than I expected to be. My manager, Derek, met me near the entrance, shook my hand with both of his, and said, "We kept your login active." He walked me back to my corner and left me to it. Exactly the right thing to do. We had already spoken honestly about a reduced schedule, about flexibility, about the fact that some days would be harder than others. But I was there, hands on a keyboard, doing the ordinary human thing of showing up somewhere and being useful. I had not understood until I lost it how much that small fact had anchored me. The work itself felt different than it had before. Not better or worse, more deliberate. I noticed things I had skipped past. The weight of a color choice. The way negative space could hold as much meaning as what was placed inside it. I was slower, but I was also somehow more present to the actual work of it. She said, "Emily." I said no. She had already come over twice that week. We had developed a rhythm during the months of my illness, that had not loosened now that the news was better. She would come over and we would cook together, badly and cheerfully. Or we would sit on the balcony with tea and talk about nothing in particular. The kind of conversation that does not need to go anywhere because going somewhere is not the point. Cal came by on Saturdays when his schedule allowed. He brought his terrible taste in movies, and I let him. And we sat on the couch and picked apart the plot holes. And it was the most normal I had felt in longer than I could name. There were moments in those evenings when I forgot, briefly, completely, that any of it had happened. And then I remembered, and the remembering no longer landed with dread. It landed with something closer to gratitude. Doctor. Webb had said something in one of our sessions that I kept turning over. He said that survival was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a different chapter. And that the work of that chapter was not about returning to who I was before. You don't step back into a self that was built by a different life. I had not been sure what that meant when he said it. I was starting to understand it now. There were still hard days. Mornings when the fatigue settled in like weather, and I could not fight it and did not try. Follow-up appointments that sent my anxiety climbing in the days before them. And there would be more scans, more monitoring, more of the long vigilance that survivorship required. Not a clean finish line, but an ongoing relationship with uncertainty and care. I did not pretend otherwise. I had learned the cost of pretending otherwise. But there was also the morning I walked around the block twice, then a third time, because the air was good, and I could. I told her I was thinking about it. I meant it. The cactus on the windowsill had grown a small new arm, while I was not watching. The watercolor set had graduated to a larger pad, and the first painting on it was nearly done. I had lived. I was really living now. The particular kind of living that knows exactly what it almost lost. And underneath all of it, quiet and permanent as scar tissue, was the memory of that first office. That first dismissal. The voice that told me I was anxious and needed to relax. The months I had spent doubting myself because someone with authority had looked at me and decided not to look further. I did not carry it with bitterness anymore. Or not only bitterness. I carried it as evidence. As testimony. A reminder that I had known something was wrong before a single person believed me. And I had been right. I had survived a disease. But first, I had survived being told there was nothing wrong with me. And I had learned, in the space between those two things, who would stay. Margaret, who had sat with me through the worst of the waiting. Cal, who had never once made me feel like a burden. Dr. Webb, who had treated my fear as information rather than noise. And Dr. Okafor, who had looked further when someone else had not. I carried all of them with me. And I had learned, at a price I would not have chosen, that you are always entitled to seek a second opinion, to ask more questions, to find someone who will actually listen. Because no one should have to accept being dismissed when something in them insists otherwise. Not by a doctor who does not look further. Not by a system that does not have time for you. You know your body. That knowledge is yours. Hold on to it. I have been thinking lately about scars. Not only the visible kind, though I have those too. The small marks left by needles and procedures. The way my body now tells its own story in a language written under the skin. I mean the other kind. The ones no one can see when you walk into a room. The ones that live in the pause before you answer, when someone asks how you are. The ones that quietly and permanently reshaped how I move through the world. The way water changes stone. But here is what I know now that I did not know then. Those invisible scars are also a kind of map. They show you exactly where you have been. And more importantly, they show you that you survived the getting there. Before I go further, let me ask you something. What would have happened if I had listened? If I had gone home that day the way Dr. Adams told me to? If I had accepted the pamphlet on stress reduction and the suggestion that what I was feeling was anxiety, and I had done exactly what a reasonable, trusting patient is supposed to do, would I be here right now telling you this story? I genuinely do not know. And not knowing that is something I will carry for the rest of my life. But here is what changed everything. I did not listen. I walked back in. I pushed harder. I found Dr. Reyes, and she looked at me like someone who had not already written the ending before I opened my mouth. That choice, to trust my own body over someone else's certainty, is the reason this story has a second half. I think about Dr. Adams often, not with the white-hot anger I once felt, though that anger was real, it was earned, and I do not apologize for it. I think about him now with something colder, something more considered. He was not a villain in the dramatic sense. He was something more ordinary, and in some ways more frightening. He was a man who had already decided what I was before I finished speaking. He looked at me and saw anxiety where there was illness. And because he had authority, and because I had been taught to trust authority, I almost let that be the end of my story. I did not, but I almost did. And the distance between those two outcomes is the whole lesson. You are the only person who has ever lived a single day inside your body. You are the only witness to what your normal feels like, what has shifted, what is wrong in a way you cannot name but cannot unfeel. That knowledge is not nothing. It is not hysteria. It is not anxiety. It is evidence. And you are allowed to keep presenting it until someone in that room finally takes it seriously. I did not know that when I walked into Dr. Adams's office for the first time. I know it now in a way that goes all the way down. The illness changed my perspective on things I thought I had already understood. I thought I understood that time was finite, that health was fragile. But I understood those things intellectually before something arrived to teach them through the body instead of the mind. Now I understand them as someone who sat in a hospital room and genuinely did not know what came next. And that understanding rearranges things. It rearranges what I give my attention to. What I reach for when I have a free afternoon and the whole of it is mine. I reach for the real things now. The conversations that go somewhere honest. The meals that run long because the company is worth it. The morning light on the balcony before I have had to be anything for anyone. Without apology, and without the vague guilt I used to carry, that I should be doing something more productive. This is the productive thing. Being here. Being present. Paying attention to the life that nearly slipped away while I was being told to go home and relax. I think about Dr. Reyes too, because she is as central to this story as Dr. Adams is, and I want that to land clearly. She is what it looks like when someone in that same position of authority chooses differently. She listened. She looked further. She did not translate my words into something more convenient. And because she made that choice, the story did not end where it almost ended. The distance between what they each did is not a footnote. It is the entire point. It is the proof that the system is not fixed. It is made of people, and people can choose. I think about the people sitting in waiting rooms right now, describing something real and being handed a dismissal. I know that cost. I paid it. And carrying that knowledge has made me different in ways I am still discovering. When I meet someone who is frightened, who feels invisible inside a system too large and too fast to truly see them, I know what to say, not because I have answers, but because I have the particular kind of understanding that only comes from having been inside a fear like that and found your way through anyway. My pain was real. My fight was real. Every appointment I pushed for, every second opinion I sought, every moment I chose to trust what I knew about my own body over what I was being told to feel. All of it was real, and all of it mattered. This story was never only mine. It belongs to everyone who has ever sat in a too bright office and felt that what they were experiencing was not being fully heard. It belongs to everyone whose truth was met with silence, and to everyone who was lucky enough to find, eventually, the person who finally heard them. So, if you are in the middle of it right now, if you are the person in the waiting room, or the person who just went home and took the pamphlet and is trying to believe that what you feel is just stress, hear this. You are allowed to go back. You are allowed to say it again, louder, to someone else. You are allowed to be the most inconvenient patient in the room until someone finally pays attention. I carried my own voice through something that tried to take it from me, and I intend to use it, clearly, precisely, and for as long as I draw breath, for every person who has not yet been able to find theirs. If you have ever walked out of a doctor's office feeling more alone than when you walked in, this moment is for you. My name is Emily. For years, I knew something was wrong inside my body, while every person with a medical degree told me I was fine. What happened next almost cost me everything. And what I learned on the other side of it is something I am not willing to keep to myself. Maybe you are sitting with a diagnosis that does not feel right. Maybe you are sitting with no diagnosis at all. The kind where you walk out of an office with nothing resolved and start to wonder if you imagined the whole thing. Maybe you have been dismissed once, twice, more times than you can count, and each dismissal has quietly chipped away at the part of you that trusted yourself. I know that place. I lived there longer than I ever should have had to. So let me say something clearly. Something I needed someone to say to me before I had to learn it the hard way. Your body is not lying to you. Whatever you are feeling, whatever has shifted in a way you cannot explain but cannot shake, that signal is real. It is data. It deserves to be taken seriously. And if the first person you bring it to does not take it seriously, that says something about their limitations, not the legitimacy of your pain. Seek a second opinion. I cannot say this loudly enough. I nearly lost so much because I waited too long to find a doctor who would actually look at the full picture. The system will not always advocate for you. You have to push, even when pushing costs you more than you have, especially then. No one else gets to be the final authority on what is happening inside your body. Not a doctor who has already made up their mind. Not a waiting room packed with too many people. Not a system moving too fast to see you clearly. You are the only person who has ever lived inside your body. That knowledge is not hysteria. It is not weakness. It is the most important evidence in the room. And you are allowed to keep presenting it until someone finally treats it that way. There is a particular kind of strength that lives inside vulnerability. Every time I sat in a waiting room terrified and stayed anyway. Every time I described my symptoms one more time to one more unfamiliar face. Every time I let someone see how frightened I actually was, because there was no longer any point in pretending otherwise. That was not weakness. That was courage doing the only thing it could. Showing up without armor. Vulnerability. The real kind, the kind that asks for help and refuses to go quiet, does not leave you exposed. It moves you forward when nothing else will. I think about the version of me who sat alone in that first waiting room, certain something was wrong, and equally certain no one would believe her. I wish I could go back and tell her she was right to trust herself, that the road ahead was longer and harder than she expected, and that she would find her way through it anyway. I cannot go back, but I can turn around and tell you. If you have been through something like this, leave a comment. Tell me where you are in your story. Whether you are at the beginning, where nothing makes sense yet, or somewhere in the middle, still fighting to be believed, or on the other side of it, carrying everything the way I carry mine. You are not alone. And sometimes the most important thing is simply knowing that someone else has been inside a fear like yours and walked out the other side. Share this if you think someone needs to hear it. There is someone in your life right now who needed these words years ago. Getting this to them might be the thing that changes what they do next. And that is not a small thing. And if something feels wrong right now and you have not yet spoken to anyone, please do. Start with your doctor. If you are not heard, seek another. Bring someone with you who can help you hold your voice steady when the room feels too loud. Write your symptoms down before you go in. Bring a list of questions and do not leave until they are answered. Ask for help. It is the most powerful thing you can do with what your body is already trying to tell you. I am still here. Still learning what it means to live carefully and fully at the same time. Still painting imperfect watercolors on Saturday mornings. Still watching the cactus on my windowsill, the one that outlasted every hard season alongside me, grow its slow, stubborn little arms. Still grateful, in a way that goes deeper than I can put into words, for Dr. Reyes, who finally listened. For my sister, who sat beside me when I could not sit alone. For every stranger in a comment section who said me too and meant it. And for the version of myself who refused to go quiet until the right person finally did. Thank you for being here with me through all of this. Take care of yourselves. Really take care of yourselves. And do not let anyone convince you that what you feel is not worth the fight, because it always, always is.